If you enjoy the content on this channel, please like and subscribe. Who Killed WCW is an American documentary television series. The series premiered on Vice Television on June 4th, 2024. The series explores the downfall of World Championship Wrestling, better known as WCW, interviewing various wrestlers, staff members, and exploring the Monday Night War and the eventual demise of the purchase by WWE back in 2001. The series features interviews with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Bill Goldberg, Eric Bischoff, Bret Hart, Booker T, and Konnan, amongst others. Episode 1 is called Where the Big Boys Play, and it deals with Eric Bischoff, who is given control of WCW, working with Hulk Hogan to create a rival to the WWF during the 1990s. The episode drew 138,000 viewers. Episode 2 is called The Streak is Over. This episode deals with WCW taking the lead against the WWF for 83 weeks. It also shows how the biggest stars began to put their egos and own interests ahead of the need of the business. Episode 3, titled New Blood, focuses on Vince Russo being brought on board to help reinvent the product. Russo, who had major success being the lead writer on WWF during the Attitude Era, grew disgruntled with Vince McMahon's product and decided to jump ship to the WCW. Unfortunately though, this led to a downward spiral in programming, as Russo would rely on shock tactics, namely crash television. The final episode is called The Final Nitro and deals with the final and eventual demise of WCW, when it was sold off in March of 2001 to WWF. Some interesting trivia notes. Previous productions on the subject of WCW all made by WWE, the company that bought WCW in the end. This series though is not affiliated with WWE, as the creators wanted to tell the story from the WCW side and without WWE's influence. The interesting bit is that major backer and the producer for the product is Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson through his production company 7 Bucks Productions. Johnson, a wrestler most famous for working with the WWE and who's also now a shareholder within TKO, a holding company for both WWE and UFC. So ironically, even though it isn't directly a WWE production, it still has WWE links. Chris Jericho, who currently works for AEW, declined to appear based on his view that as the narrator of the Dark Side of the Ring series was too closely associated with the producers. Evan Husney and Jason Eisner, the producers of Dark Side of the Ring, a show that focuses on the darker and more controversial tales of the wrestling industry, executive produce this show. The show has been heavily criticized by former WCW commentator Tony Schiavone. Episodes 2 and 3 were heavily criticized by the Wrestling Observer newsletter, which of course is run by Dave Meltzer and Brian Alvarez, two prominent wrestling journalists. They criticized the poor fact-checking, lack of critique, and lack of pushback against narrative pushed by the featured talking heads, most particularly that of Eric Bischoff, who used to run WCW. In particular, they criticized the narrative that WCW was ultimately driven down by Time Warner management, rather than the poor internal decisions by Eric Bischoff and WCW itself. Now look, I went into this documentary absolutely fascinated and riveted. I've always been truly intrigued by the downfall of WCW. This was a massive wrestling promotion, and at one stage the biggest in the world. For some 83 weeks, between 1997 and 1998, WCW was outdrawing the WWF as it was known back then. So much so that Vince McMahon had to literally recreate his own product. He brought in the likes of Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock and created the Attitude Era, allowing WWE to be more adult and controversial. The WCW, who had gained the likes of Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and even Randy Savage, had become the place to be. And the Monday Night Wars, as it was known, where the two shows would literally go head to head between the hours of 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. every Monday, must have been absolutely riveting, as people had to change back and forth to see what the one show would do next in order to gain attention and more viewership. Unfortunately, I wasn't a fan back then, so I only can go on what I've heard in documentaries. The downfall of WCW is a complicated issue. It's not like just one person was responsible for the whole demise, as it were. The company itself was founded by Ted Turner, an American entrepreneur, television producer, media proprietor, and philanthropist, who also of course founded CNN, the first 24-hour cable news channel. He would later of course also found WTBS, which pioneered the superstation concept in cable television, which of course later became TBS. Turner purchased the assets of National Wrestling Alliance territory Jim Crockett Promotions and decided to call it World Championship Wrestling. The company would appoint Eric Bischoff to the role of executive producer in 1993. Under Bischoff's leadership, the company enjoyed a period of mainstream success, characterized by a shift to reality-based storylines and notable hirings of former WWF stars, as I mentioned earlier, namely Hulk Hogan. WCW also gained attention for developing the popular cruiserweight division, which showcased more acrobatic, fast-paced, lucha libre-inspired style of wrestling. As I mentioned earlier, in 1995, Monday Nitro was aired at the exact same time as Monday Night Raw, and for those 83 weeks, WCW was the main wrestling show in the world. But beginning in 1999, WCW endured significant losses in ratings and revenue due to creative missteps and poor decision-making. One of the biggest mistakes they made was allowing Hulk Hogan to have full creative control over his own storylines. This was always going to end up in a mess, as like any major star, Hulk Hogan had a major ego and wanted to do things right by himself and his friends. Bischoff also seemingly lost the plot and got lost in between being a creator and a character. And bringing in a man like Vince Russo, who literally wanted to model the show on the Jerry Springer Show, was never going to work out long term. In 2001, the merger of American Online, AOL, and Turner Broadcasting parent company Time Warner, later Warner Media and now known as Warner Brothers Discovery, also didn't help. Soon thereafter, WCW would be shut down, and the WWF would purchase the assets in 2001, including its video library, intellectual property, and even some of the wrestler contracts. For a company at one stage that was generating $55 million in profit, which is a huge amount of money, especially in the late 90s, to being sold for just $4.5 million to Vince McMahon's WWF, well, is a real lesson in how not to run a company. This is a story that should be studied by business majors. And no, it wasn't just one thing that killed WCW. It was multiple choices, bad creative and business decisions, that led to this untimely demise of this once great wrestling company. Often Jamie Kellner, who was CEO of Turner Broadcasting at the time, was blamed for pulling the plug on WCW, as he himself was not a fan of wrestling and didn't see a need for it on the Turner Broadcasting network. But at the end of the day, there are multiple reasons for the financial failure and eventual closing of WCW. So the question is, who killed WCW? Well, multiple people are responsible, from the business executives at Time Warner, as it was known back then, to the creative heads like Eric Bischoff and Vince Russo, to even the wrestlers themselves, who at times just didn't care. The fall of WCW is a real lesson in how not to run a business. This documentary has unfortunately stirred up a lot of controversy within the wrestling media. Though I found it introspective and interesting, there will always be many debates within the wrestling community as to what really led to WCW's final demise. In saying that though, getting interviews with some of the most prominent figures within the wrestling industry, with the exception of course of Hulk Hogan for this one, still held my interest, and each episode I felt was well paced, introspective and interesting, albeit an interpretive angle on who really killed WCW. Who Killed WCW gets an 8.5 out of 10.